Okay, so I know it's been a couple weeks, so I'm going to do a little review to get us caught back up on a couple of points. First, and in a general sense, we talked last time about how sort of in the background, as we've been going through the book of Judges, how the religion that the Israelites are supposed to be practicing, as we saw it set up in the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, the way they were supposed to worship God isn't really the way they're worshiping God. They haven't been passing that on from generation to generation during this period, and that instead this sort of weird hybrid of paganism and the religion they're supposed to be practicing has sort of developed, and that's what the people are actually practicing. We talked about that a little bit last time. I wanted to comment a little further on that now because I watched another couple documentaries on TV, and so I have to again point out something that goes on when you read books about ancient Israel or watch these documentaries on ancient Israel. The earliest archaeological information we have about Israel and its religion is about this sort of paganism that developed. So you will hear people presenting themselves as scholars talking about things like Yahweh being a storm god in ancient Canaan. Okay, and you might hear that go, what? Well, that's coming from this kind of paganism because Baal was a storm god. And so, as we've seen, they're sort of smushing together the Canaanite paganism that they've come into and the worship of Yahweh. Okay. Now, that's our perspective as people who believe that the Bible is true, is that God brought them out of Egypt, told them to worship Him in this particular way. Instead, they started following the pagan practices of those around them. Okay, that's our perspective because that's what the Bible says. Scholars will say, well, the earliest archaeological evidence we have is of this kind of paganism. So this paganism came first. Okay. Later on, monotheism developed. Okay. And so anything having to do with monotheism, like the book of Deuteronomy or any of these things we've read, must have been written later and made up about the past. Okay. So the assumption they're going from is that, first off, no religions are actually true. In their minds, Canaanite paganism, not true. Judaism, also not true. So religion just sort of evolves culturally in an anthropological way. And so this kind of pagan polytheism is more primitive, so that must come first. And then as the society develops, it becomes more religiously sophisticated in its religious and philosophical ideas. And so all these ideas must be later developments. Okay. So because that's their assumption, I've talked about as we've been going, some of the things we read in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, how those ideas don't belong in the Bronze Age. Right? Well, the scholar's answer to that, who doesn't want to believe that it's true, is, well, then clearly it wasn't written in the Bronze Age. Their answer is, clearly this must have been written much later, and they're falsifying that this Moses person wrote it, or falsifying that this Moses person even existed. Okay? So you have to keep in mind when you're watching these documentaries or reading books about this period that the secular historians are coming at it from that bias. Okay, so it's not going to be, isn't it amazing that we find this sophisticated religious idea back in ancient Judaism? Because that doesn't work. It's clearly, this isn't really what happened. Because that's too sophisticated for that time in history. So that must be later, and they're reading it back. So they're going to say that this paganism was the original, and that some hundreds of years later, they came and read back and said these people should have been monotheists, like us now. Okay. I wanted to cover that briefly just because, like I said, I watched a couple other documentaries, and it brought it to mind again. And it's going to come up. It's going to come up again tonight. We're probably going to finish the book of Judges tonight. And we're going to see that the religion they're practicing bears, at this point in Judges, bears little to no resemblance to the religion we saw described in the Pentateuch.
You mean Cecil B. DeMille was wrong?
He took some artistic license. Okay.
Wouldn't a pagan religion leave more artifacts anyway because of the way they worshipped?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, if the Israelites actually did at any point worship God without idols, whereas you have another religion that uses idols, if you're digging in the dirt, you're going to find the idols, right? I mean, you're going to find the stone statues. Yeah. You're not going to find relics of statueless worship, right? So that's a good point. That yes, you'd expect a pagan religion like that is going to have many more, And also, if, as we were told, the correct worship of Yahweh only took place at one place, whereas the pagans are setting up altars all over the place, you're going to find a lot more pagan shrines than you're going to find. You're going to find what we would call real shrines to Yahweh. So that comes into effect too. So in terms of where we are right now, we're going to be picking up in a minute in chapter 14. In chapter 13, that was the beginning of the story of Samson. And Samson is, in the book of Judges that we've been reading, it's about this period in the history of Israel and a number of things that happened during that time period. Samson is the last of the judges. We've talked about these judges are people who are called by God in a particular circumstance to come and deliver Israel from an oppressor. There's been this cycle where Israel falls into grievous sin. They go way off of where they're supposed to be. Again. And again and again. They go way off of where they're supposed to be. And so, to get them to repent, God sends one of their neighboring nations in to come and take them over and oppress them. Israel, more from being tired of being oppressed than from getting the message, calls out to God, deliver us from these oppressors. God sends someone to deliver them. And then usually not long after they're delivered, they go right back to what they were doing, and the whole cycle repeats. And we've been seeing, as we've gone through the book of Judges, that this has kind of gotten worse and worse. That Israel, rather than having these episodes call them back to God, it's just been descending. And the knowledge of God is sort of disappearing in Israel, and obedience is disappearing. And even the judges themselves, the early judges we saw, sort of stood up. Othniel, the first judge, who was Caleb, who we read about in Joshua's son-in-law, stood up, goes out, does what God commands, is victorious. There's peace in the land. Everything's great. By the time we've gotten to the last couple of judges, like Gideon, set up a shrine to himself to be worshipped, tried to make himself king. So we've had a general decline in the quality of judge, too. And this now brings us to Samson, who's going to be the last of the judges per se. Even though his story isn't the last story of the book of Judges, he's the last judge, as it were, in the book of Judges. Now, what we read in chapter 13 at the end last time sounded very promising and somewhat familiar. There was this couple, had been trying to have children, couldn't have children. An angel came to them. Right? The angel says, you're going to have a son. Your son's going to deliver Israel from the Philistines, who have been oppressing Israel now for 40 years. 40 years, and so rejoice, prepare to raise him. Now we've seen a little bit of a troubling note in that their response to the angel was sort of, well, how do we raise him? The idea being that they sort of no longer have a knowledge of God's law and his teaching that they would need in order to raise this child the way they should. The other troubling note, as we noted, is that these people and this son, Samson, who's going to be born, is from the tribe of Dan. Back at the end of the book of Genesis, we talked about how there was this prophecy about Dan, that it was a viper, all these horrible things about it. We talked about how when we get to the New Testament, to the book of Revelation, and the 12 tribes of Israel are listed, Dan is missing. Dan gets replaced by one of the half-tribes, one of the two sons of Joseph. Okay? So, and we saw at the end of Joshua that Dan is one of the tribes that did not do what it was supposed to do. Didn't follow God's command. So Dan, not a very heroic tribe, not the most auspicious place or tribe to be from. Okay. Part of what the angel told Samson's parents is that their son was going to be a Nazirite from birth. We talked about the Nazirite vows back in Numbers briefly. This is sort of the first thing we have in Scripture similar to what we call monasticism today. Nazirite vow could be taken by any Israelite who wanted to dedicate themselves to God. In most cases, they would do it for a period of time, or they would do it as an adult. As an adult, they would become a Nazirite for the rest of their life. Okay? In this case, Samson's parents are told he's going to be a Nazirite from birth. Okay? The other major person in Scripture who's a Nazirite from birth is St. John the Forerunner, St. John the Baptist. Okay? Now, a Nazirite, if you became a Nazirite as an adult, you would take these vows, and at the time you took the Nazirite vows, you would shave your head and your face completely as a man, and then you would take a vow that you would touch nothing unclean, you would not expose yourself to any uncleanness, that you would not drink any alcoholic beverages, and that you would not cut your hair or shave from that point on. So you were starting from nothing, but from that point on, you just let everything grow. Okay? So the idea with Samson is the angel has to explain to the parents, because they're kind of unclear on exactly what the Nazirite vows even are, is that from birth, Samson is not to touch anything unclean, not to drink any wine or other fermented drink, and not to cut his hair or shave his beard from birth. Okay, and this is going to be a symbol that this child, this person, is dedicated to God and is going to deliver the people of Israel from the Philistines. And right where we left off at the end of chapter 13 last time, his mother gave birth to him, named him Samson. He grew and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in Mahanadan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Okay, so that was our sort of promising start where we left off. So chapter 14, verse 1. Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. So we're already a little off track. Right? We're already a little off track. The first words out of Samson's mouth are, I want to go marry me that foreigner. Which is one of the prototypical things that no Israelite is supposed to do, let alone somebody who's supposed to be especially set apart. And technically, since she's a foreigner, she's unclean. And I'm imagining he's planning on touching her. Based on him asking to have her for his wife. Okay, so in verse 3, his father and mother replied, Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or amongst all our people? Like there's no women in the tribe of Dan, or heck, any tribe of Israel? Nobody? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, she's the right one for me. And there's sort of this parenthetical comment in verse 4. His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. Okay, so that's sort of in the background. God is using this to set up for a confrontation with the Philistines. So verse 5, Samson went down to Timnah together with his father and mother. As they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring toward him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and he liked her. Okay. So we see already he's gifted with obviously great strength, since he's taking out a lion with his bare hands. Okay, now, Palestinian lions are extinct. So, Palestinian lions were about the size of a Labrador. Okay, they were lions, but they were smaller than like the African lions we're used to seeing and thinking of. And a lot of the Egyptian kings, in particular, and later the Assyrian kings, would domesticate them. They'd have them on chains, in their palace as sort of symbols of their power. Okay. And much later, around the 4th century, St. Jerome had a pet Palestinian lion before they went extinct. That lived with him in a cave. But this is still a pretty impressive feat. I mean, if you imagine just a pit bull jumping at you and you ripping it in half with your bare hands, that's a pretty major feat. But so he goes and he talks to the Philistine woman and decides, yep, she's a keeper. So verse 8, sometime later when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass. In it was a swarm of bees and some honey, which he scooped out with his hands and ate as he went along. Okay, so he sees this carcass, like the lion he killed sometime later, and bees have nested in it. There's a honeycomb, so he goes and grabs it, and as he's walking along, he eats the honeycomb. So, from the book of Leviticus, what was pretty much the first listed unclean thing you weren't supposed to touch? Animal carcass. Okay? Animal carcass. He's not only touching it, he's eating out of it. Okay? When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some, and they too ate it, but he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from a lion's carcass. Now his father went down to see the woman, and Samson made a feast there as was customary for bridegrooms. When he appeared, he was given 30 companions. Okay, what does this he was given 30 companions mean? And where did they go? Remember where it said they were heading in Timnah? The vineyards. Okay, so he's throwing a wedding party at the vineyards in Timnah. Okay, these companions who are given to him is that in the wedding, the pagan wedding ritual at this time, you had a sort of big, like we have a bridal party. They had a large bridal party and groom's party. Okay? So the idea is he doesn't go down there with a bunch of people from the tribe of Dan to be his wedding party, as if he's going to marry this woman and bring her into Israel. Right? Because we've seen that. And then she would be considered an Israelite. Right? He goes down there and takes 30 Philistines as his buddies to stand up with him at the wedding. Okay? So, not only is he marrying a Philistine, he's having a Philistine wedding. And a Philistine wedding drinking party. Okay, here at Timnah. So again, he's been called to be set apart by God as an Israelite to deliver Israel from the Philistines. And instead he's now hanging out with the Philistines.
And partying.
And partying with the Philistines and marrying a Philistine. Okay. So verse 12, let me tell you a riddle, Samson said to them. These are to his 30 companions, his groomsmen. If you can give me the answer within the 7 days of the feast, because yes, this drinking party went on for a full week, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't tell me the answer, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. Okay, so party game. Okay. I'll tell you a riddle. If you can solve it, I'll give you all nice new outfits. If you can't solve it, each of you is going to give me nice outfits. Tell us your riddle, they said. Let's hear it. He replied, out of the eater something to eat, out of the strong something sweet. For 3 days they could not give the answer. On the 4th day they said to Samson's wife, coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death. So these are nice Philistines. Did you invite us here to rob us? So these Philistines who got called on to be part of the groom's party, they're like, hey, if we can't solve this riddle, we gotta pony up. We gotta pony up on this bet. You know, you invite us to this party and now you're gonna bankrupt us, having to pay off this deal. You need to go to your husband and tell us the answer so that we can win this bet, or we're going to set you and your family on fire. So verse 16, then Samson's wife threw herself on him sobbing, you hate me, you don't really love me, you've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. I haven't even explained it to my father or mother, he replied, so why would I explain it to you? This is the woman he's marrying. So he basically, under the threat that they're going to burn her family alive, tells her to buzz off.
But she forgot to tell him.
So verse 17, she cried the whole 7 days of the feast. Okay, because she's looking at getting burned to death. So the 7th day he finally told her because she continued to press him. Okay, so finally he's like, okay, fine. Tells her the answer. She in turn explained the riddle to her people. Before sunset on the 7th day, the men of the town said to him, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? Right, so they figure it out. It's that honey you got from the lion. Samson said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Again, a very nice way to refer to the woman he's about to marry. Okay. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. He went down to Ashkelon, and that's on your map if you have it there. That's one of the major coast cities of the Philistines. Struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of their belongings, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Okay. So he says, I'll pay off your bet. He goes and he kills 30 Philistines, takes their clothes, and gives them to the guys he made the bet with. And then burning with anger, he went up to his father's house. Okay, so he's had it. He leaves. Returns to his parents. And Samson's wife was given to the friend who had attended him at his wedding. Okay? So he gets mad. He leaves before the actual wedding happens. Okay? So they marry off the woman he was going to marry to one of the groomsmen. Okay? I guess as the movie prize. Well, we were going to have a wedding, So
Otherwise, we'll get married.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the first episode we have about Samson. Okay. And we've kind of seen that. Okay, this is the whole judging thing is reaching a new low. Okay, rather than deliver, he's killed some Philistines, but it was because he got mad because he lost a bet. Right? And he basically murdered them at random. I mean, these aren't like Philistine soldiers. He didn't go out to battle against Philistines. So he just went to one of the Philistine cities and killed 30 people. Right? And that's it. And he did it for his own selfish reasons. Right? Just out of his own rage. So chapter 15, verse 1. Another episode. in the life of Samson. Later on, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife, the one he almost married. Okay. He decides to go back down to this woman. He said, I'm going to my wife's room, but her father would not let him go in. Okay, so he shows up now to see this woman with this young goat, presumably to have some kind of dinner, have some kind of feast, have some kind of celebration. Verse 2, I was so sure you thoroughly hated her, he said, this is her father, that I gave her to your friend. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead. Okay. So he comes back and the dad says, well, I stormed off, right? Called her a heifer and took off back to your parents. I thought you didn't want her. Okay, so we married her off. Tell you what, she's got a sister. Better looking. Right? So he tries to resolve things that way. Samson responds, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really hurt them. Okay, so now he's like, I was just mad before. Now I've got a right to take some vengeance because they married my wife to somebody else. So he went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches, and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and standing grain together with the vineyards and olive groves.
Animal cruelty.
Yeah, so animal cruelty. Goes and catches a bunch of foxes. Basically ties their tails to torches, lights the torches, and sets them loose to destroy all the crops of the Philistines because they married his wife to someone else. Yeah.
His significant other.
Yeah. So verse 6, when the Philistines asked who did this, they were told Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his friend. Okay. So the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death. Okay, so the pagans say, who wrecked our crops this year? Right? It was this guy's son-in-law because he married off his daughter to someone else. So they say, well, we don't want any more of this crop burning stuff, so we'll just get rid of the problem. They go and execute the man and his daughter. Verse 7, how do you suppose Samson might react to this?
That was really bad.
Samson said to them, since you've acted like this, I won't stop until I've had my revenge on you. He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. Then he went down and stayed in a cave in the rock of Edom. Okay, so he goes and slaughters all the Philistines who were involved. They apparently came to him saying, okay, we took care of that no good father-in-law of yours and that no good cheating woman. And he slaughters them in response. So he goes and goes to stay in this cave. So verse 9, the Philistines went up and camped in Judah, spreading out near Lehi. The men of Judah asked, why have you come to fight us? So these Philistines come looking for Samson after everything he's done. And they're following him. So they have this big camp set up on what's Judah's territory. So the men of Judah are like, whoa, where is this Philistine army coming from? What's going on? So they say, why have you come to fight us? We have come to take Samson prisoner, they answered, to do to him as he did to us. Okay, so now they want their revenge on Samson. Then 3,000 men from Judah went down to the cave in the rock of Edom and said to Samson, don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us? And they come and say, look, we're basically under the power of the Philistines right now. They're going to come here and they're going to kill us because of your shenanigans, right? What are you doing? Now does Samson say, God raised me up to deliver you from the Philistines? Samson said, swear to me that you, or he answered, I merely did to them what they did to me. Not I'm here to deliver you from the Philistines on behalf of Yahweh. Hey, they had it coming after what they did to me. Verse 12, they said to him, we've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. So the men of Judah, hey, we want no part of this. We're going to just give you to them and you guys can work this out. Right? Samson said, swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves. Agreed, they answered, we will only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him shouting. So they don't even wait. Philistines are so mad at this point, they don't even wait for Samson to get turned over. As soon as they see him, they just attack. Okay. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. So he finds this donkey jawbone laying there, picks it up, just slaughters, wades in, starts slaughtering the Philistine army. Right? Jawbone. Carcass. Okay.
And then he gets drunk.
Okay. And then Samson said, with a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was called Ramath Lehi, which means Jawbone Hill. Okay. Now he's killed 1,000 Philistines. His death toll is up, but again, what's motivating it? Bad temper, right? So in verse 18, because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, you have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? So who does that sound like?
The Israelites in the desert.
The Israelites in the desert, right? Did you just drag us out here to die, right? Every 5 minutes. So now Samson gets thirsty and, why are you just going to let me die of thirst? This is, by the way, the first time we've actually seen him call upon the Lord. This is how he talks to God. Then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. So the spring was called En Hakore, which means Caller's Spring, and it is still there in Lehi. Samson judged Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Okay. We're not quite done with Samson yet, though. Chapter 16, we get another episode. Chapter 16, verse 1. One day Samson went to Gaza where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. Okay. You can see how each of these stories sort of begins, right, about Samson. Okay. The people of Gaza were told, Samson is here. Now Gaza, on the map you can see it's south of Ashkelon on the coast. This is another one of the major Philistine cities. Okay, so Samson just shows up in this Philistine city, decides to spend the night with this prostitute. The people of Gaza get told, hey, Samson's here. So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, at dawn we'll kill him. But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. Then he got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the 2 posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Okay, so he basically rips the gate off the city to leave after it's sealed up at night, to leave in the middle of the night before they can ambush him. Okay. Verse 4, sometime later he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah.
He gets around, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. Delilah, not a good name to name your daughter in the church. Just going to throw that out. So the rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, "See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him, so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver." Okay, that's about 28 pounds of silver. Each of us will give you 28 pounds. Okay, so the Philistines have had it. They're done with this guy. They've obviously figured out that women are kryptonite for Samson. So they ask Delilah, "Look, find out how he does this stuff and what we can do to catch him. And we'll give you all the wealth you could possibly want." So Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you could be tied up and subdued." Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh thongs that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man." And the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh thongs that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. With men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the thongs as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." He said, "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him with them. Then with men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the ropes off his arms as if they were threads.
Why did he allow her to
Yeah,
tie
I
him?
don't know. I did not.
The idea is that he's most likely asleep.
Oh, okay.
He's asleep, and she ties him, and then yells to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you. The Philistines are coming for you," right? And he jumps up and rips out of whatever it is.
Yeah, but can't he
Did
tell?
he realize what's happening?
Well, he isn't telling her the truth,
Yeah, I know. Well,
so he's not really worried about it.
Not the brightest light in the room.
Well, that's true too. He's not the sharpest tool in the drawer. But he's also not telling her the truth.
True.
Right? He knows full well he's going to be able to snap out of whatever this is.
Yeah, but why does he keep? Why did he tell her the truth eventually? I don't
Well,
know. Stupid.
well, as you can see, since he's asleep during this, he keeps spending the night with her too.
Yeah.
Right? So he keeps telling her stories so he can hang around. Right? That's- So Delilah then said to Samson, "Until now you have been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me how you could be tied." He replied, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with a pin. Again she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and pulled up the pin in the loom with the fabric. Okay. So again, right? Then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me?" Okay, now they need to have a relationship talk. Right? "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was tired to death. It literally says in the original, until he wanted death. Okay? So she nagged him until he wanted to die, right? You just had it with her. So verse 17, so he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite set apart to God since birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." He's sort of a Nazirite. Right. Okay. When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more, he has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. Having put him to sleep on her lap, she called a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair. and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Okay? So it's not that Samson had magic hair that made him strong. Okay? It's that God gave him strength because he was called to be this special person set apart to deliver Israel, to accomplish this purpose of God. The reason he loses his strength is that once he's broken every single vow
Couple of times.
that he took, in some cases many times, right? He's broken every single vow he took. Okay, he's completely turned his back on God at this point. There's not one thing he's been obedient in. That's why the strength leaves him. It's not magic hair. Right? He's abandoned God. And so finally at this point, when he's completely abandoned God, God is going to abandon him. So verse 20, then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Okay, so it says they bound him with bronze shackles to grind in a prison. The way they ground wheat at that time was they had two huge, round millstones. The grain would be put between the two stones. Those stones had to be turned. So what that means is he was shackled to a post coming out of the top millstone. And he spent all day, as long as the taskmaster was there whipping him, walking around in a circle. With his eyes gouged out, chained to this grinding stone. So this is a pretty nasty fate that falls upon him once he's completely abandoned God. And John Milton, just as a side note, who wrote Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, the epic poems, he also wrote a poem called Samson Agonistes, which is sort of written from what he imagines to be Samson's perspective at this point in his life, where he's basically now cursed and toiling in this dungeon. So verse 23, now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to celebrate, saying, our God has delivered Samson our enemy into our hands. Now Dagon is going to be referred to as Dagon in the Old Testament here, whenever we're talking about the Philistines. That's not what the Philistines called their god, because it means little fish in Hebrew. Okay, the god that the Philistines actually worshipped was basically Poseidon, that we know from later Greek mythology. Okay, it was an early primitive form of the Greek Poseidon. He was an ocean god. Calling him little fish is sort of a jab from the Hebrew writers at this supposed ocean god. Okay. So they're going to have this big festival, this big party, celebrating the fact that supposedly their God, Dagon, has delivered Samson into their hands, and they've been victorious thanks to their God. Okay. Now you can imagine, probably not going to sit real well with the real God, right? So verse 24, when the people saw Samson, they praised their God, saying, our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain. While they were in high spirits, they shouted, bring out Samson to entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. This doesn't mean he did the soft shoe. This probably means they threw things at him, poked him with sticks, abused him, ridiculed him. I mean, given, his eyes have been gouged out and he's in chains. So to further humiliate him, they drag him out. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." So they've got this servant who's got his chains, who drug him out. He can't see, he's blind. So he says, "Bring me to the main support pillars. They're holding up this temple to their God, so I can lean on them for support," like he's going to fall over. And the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there. And on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord. Okay.
For the second.
Now, if you're like me, you're hoping maybe he's learned something. Right? Maybe all this, maybe now. Right? He's gonna. He prays, "O sovereign Lord, remember me, O God. Please strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistine for my 2 eyes." Give me my strength back for a second so I can get my revenge on these no good. Okay? Now there's a striking counterpoint here. Okay? We talked about this angel coming to Samson's parents, first to his mother. We said, "Oh, that sounds familiar from the New Testament. Sounds a lot like the story of Christ." Right? Now, obviously, Samson's life has been anything but
That's right.
similar to the life of Christ. Okay, but now let's look at the end. Let's look at the end of their respective lives. Okay, we've got two images here. On the one hand, we've got Samson with his hands on these two support pillars, praying to God and asking for what?
Vengeance.
Revenge. I want to destroy these people who did this to me. On the other hand, we've got Christ with his arms stretched out on the cross, praying to God and saying what? Forgive these people who are doing this to me. Okay. The reason Samson is the last judge is because he's at the end of the slope. Okay. Samson is our picture of the Antichrist. He is. He is the opposite. He is the opposite of Christ. And this is showing us just how bad Israel has gotten, where their champion is this Antichrist. Is the opposite of everything that he was called to be. Just as Israel has now become the opposite of everything it was called to be. Nevertheless, in verse 29, then Samson reached toward the two central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Then his brothers and his father's whole family went down to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel 20 years. So God's going to deliver his people regardless. And God's not going to let Dagon steal glory from him or look like he's won regardless. Okay. But Samson has given us a pretty graphic example of the sad state. The sad state that Israel is in. Okay. And he's sort of a tragic figure. Sort of a tragic figure. And it's not the way he's usually presented. If we read about him in Sunday school, he's usually presented as sort of an action hero.
Yeah.
Which, is okay for kids because you don't want to get into some of the grisly details of this stuff, I suppose. But the reality is he's a deeply, deeply tragic person, and he's a picture of someone who's completely lost.
Like in the movies, when they make movies out of them and they can out that way.
Right, yeah. They try to turn him into Hercules.
Victor Mature.
Okay.
You can't believe in Hollywood people.
So now this, Samson is the last judge per se in the book of Judges, but the book of Judges isn't over. And just so you don't get your hopes up, it's not going to get any better. Okay. But now we're going to move on to there are two stories, big stories basically left in the book of Judges. The first one, remember we read just very briefly at the end of Joshua about how the tribe of Dan, them again, didn't take the land that God had given to them to take, but instead went up into another tribe's territory and took a city. Okay? So the first story we're going to read is the story of how that all happened and what that was all about. Now, other than just that couple of lines. And then the second story we're going to read, I won't tease too much, but things get worse. Okay? So starting in chapter 17, we have this story with the tribe of Dan. Chapter 17, verse 1, Now a man named Micah from the hill country of Ephraim said to his mother, The 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you and about which I heard you utter a curse, I have that silver with me, I took it. So this is our introduction to these characters. Hey Ma, remember all that money that disappeared? And you got mad and were cussing about it? Yeah, I took it. I've got it though. Then his mother said, The Lord bless you, my son. Well, at least she's got her money back. I thought it was gone. And that 1,100 shekels is again about 28 pounds. When he returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother, that he had stolen from his mother, she said, I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord. Well, that sounds good, right? I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord. For my son to make a carved image and a cast idol, I will give it back to you. So again,
Say that.
she says, I'm so happy I've got this money back that I thought was lost, that I'm going to give it to Yahweh by making an idol with it. That's what she said. So this is how far gone the religious sensibility is. She thinks she's doing a good religious thing by taking this money and making it idol. Verse 4, So he returned the silver to his mother, and she took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to a silversmith, who made them into the image of the idol, and they were put in Micah's house. Now this man Micah had a shrine. Okay, so not only does he now have this idol, he has a little altar there in his house. And he made an ephod and some idols and installed one of his sons as his priest. Okay, so he's kind of making up religion as he goes along. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. This is a pretty good example of someone just doing as he sees fit. Verse 7, A young Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, who had been living within the clan of Judah, left that town in search of some other place to stay. And remember, we read about how all the Levites were supposed to serve at the one sanctuary where the ark was in the tabernacle, right, which is in Shiloh. But we read how the Levites were given cities sort of scattered all over the place. And the question was sort of, how are they going to serve at the one altar of the Lord if they're scattered all over the place? Well, they're kind of wandering. So this Levite, he'd been living in Bethlehem. He decides, time for a change. I want to move somewhere else. So on his way, as he's traveling, he came to Micah's house in the hill country of Ephraim. Micah asked him, Where are you from? I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, he said, and I'm looking for a place to stay. Then Micah said to him, Live with me and be my father and priest. And I'll give you 10 shekels of silver a year, your clothes and your food. So the Levite agreed to live with him, and the young man was to him like one of his sons. So he says, Hey, I got a shrine. You're a wandering priest, I'll pay you a salary. Come move in with my family, and you can do our religious rituals. Or I got idols, I got the whole shot. Then Micah installed the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in his house. And Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since this Levite has become my priest. Now I'm all set. I got a real Levite for a priest." So
I can see why he was confused.
there's nothing in this story that makes it sound like the offer made to this Levite was atypical. So we have to assume that this is pretty much what these Levites in these scattered places are doing. They're just serving as priests to whatever.
You mean
Right.
to a town or like this individual?
Both. They're just sort of plying their religious trade. But it's got no connection to what they were told in the book of Leviticus. There's the whole book of Leviticus telling them what they were supposed to do, when they were supposed to do it, how to do it. All gone now.
At this time, what happened to the 5 books they had there trying to go by? Did them just sort of disappear by the wayside? Or, I mean...
Well, there was all that emphasis in Deuteronomy. Remember? Teach your children, teach your children's children. And they didn't.
So they just didn't do it.
And so now they don't know.
They're just floating on down.
And so everybody's just doing
Kind of sounds like.
Do it as they
what's
see
going
fit.
on now.
Okay. So Micah's all set now. He's got himself a real live Levite for his house priest. So chapter 18, verse 1, "In those days Israel had no king. And in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking a place of their own where they might settle, because they had not yet come into an inheritance among the tribes of Israel." Okay. Remember, they took a look at the place that God had told them to go and take and make their home, and kind of said, not so much. They look kind of tough. We'll scout around for other alternatives. So the Danites sent 5 warriors from Zorah and Eshtaol. Remember, that's the area where Samson was from, to spy out the land and explore it. These men represented all their clans. They told them, "Go explore the land." The men entered the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah, where they spent the night. When they were near Micah's house, they recognized the voice of the young Levite, so they turned in there and asked him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? Why are you here?" Now, recognize his voice doesn't mean like they were buddies or they went to school together or something. They recognized what he was doing, that he was a Levite and that he was doing these religious rituals. Okay. So they go and ask him, "Who are you? How do you end up here at this shrine?" He told them what Micah had done for him and said, "He has hired me and I am his priest." Then they said to him, "Please inquire of God to learn whether our journey will be successful." The priest answered them, "Go in peace. Your journey has the Lord's approval." Doesn't even have to ask anybody. So the 5 men left and came to Laish, where they saw that the people were living in safety, like the Sidonians, unsuspecting and secure. Now Laish, this is an Israelite city. Okay, Israelites have already settled there. Okay, and they see that they're living unsuspecting and secure. Right, meaning they're sort of happily going about their business, not thinking they're going to be attacked by anyone. And since their land lacked nothing, they were prosperous. Also, they lived a long way from the Sidonians. Remember, those are the Phoenicians. And had no relationship with anyone else. And if you look where the city of Dan is, way up here at the top of the map, if you still have the most recent map, what this is saying is, as you can see, it's a good distance from the coast. Right? All those Phoenician cities are on the coast. All right, they're saying, so they find this city, there's Israelites living there, pretty far from those Phoenician cities on the coast, so the Phoenicians probably won't help them. Don't have any agreement with the Syrians, the Arameans over here, so they probably won't help them if something happens. And they don't seem to see an attack coming. And you see the problem here already. These are 5 Israelites looking at an Israelite town and going, they'll never see us coming. So verse 8, when they returned to Zorah and Eshtaol, Their brothers asked them, "How did you find things?" They answered, "Come on, let's attack them. We have seen that the land is very good. Aren't you going to do something? Don't hesitate to go there and take it over." Now remember, these are the people who went and saw the land that God gave them, that they were supposed to attack, and said, whoa, 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 those Canaanites, they have armies. That's way too tough. But now they go and see this other city. Hey, they'll never see us come.
Don't have no army.
Okay. Remember the prophecy about Dan being a viper back at the end of Genesis. So we have seen that the land is very good. Aren't you going to do something? Don't hesitate to go there and take it over. When you get there, you will find an unsuspecting people and a spacious land that God has put into your hands. A land that lacks nothing whatsoever. Then 600 men from the clan of Danites, armed for battle, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol. On their way, they set up camp near Kiriath Jearim in Judah. This is why that place west of Kiriath Jearim is called Mahanadan to this day. That means Dan's camp. From there they went on to the hill country of Ephraim and came to Micah's house. So on the way again, they come across Micah's house. Then the 5 men who had spied out the land of Laish said to their brothers, "Do you know that one of these houses has an ephod, other household gods, a carved image, and a cast idol? You know what to do." Right? Say, "Oh yeah, we stopped at this house on the way. They got a lot of nice stuff." Okay. So they turned in there and went to the house of the young Levite at Micah's place and greeted him. The 600 Danites armed for battle stood at the entrance to the gate. The 5 men who had spied out the land went inside and took the carved image, the ephod, the other household gods, and the cast idol, while the priest and the 600 armed men stood at the entrance to the gate. So they go in and clean out the shrine. When these men went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the other household gods, the cast idol, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" They answered him, "Be quiet, don't say a word. Come with us and be our father and priest. Isn't it better that you serve a tribe and clan in Israel as a priest, rather than just one man's household? Hey, we'll offer you a better deal."
More money.
Right? You could be a priest for a whole tribe, not just this one guy. Okay? Then the priest was glad. This is how the priest responds. The priest responds by, "All right, jackpot." He took the ephod, the other household gods, and the carved image and went along with the people. So he helps them gather up all the stuff. Let's take this show on the road. Putting their little children, their livestock, and their possessions in front of them, they turned away and left. When they had gone some distance from Micah's house, the men who lived near Micah were called together and overtook the Danites. So Micah says, "Hey! They just took all my stuff and my priest." Right? So he rounds up his neighbors, "Let's go after them." As they shouted after them, the Danites turned and said to Micah, "What's the matter with you that you called out your men to fight?" Right there, I say, what are you doing? Buzz off. He replied, "You took the gods I made and my priest and went away. What else do I have? How can you ask what's the matter with you?" Right? He's like, "You took all my stuff, my priest." The Danites answered, "Don't argue with us, or some hot-tempered men will attack you, and you and your family will lose your lives." He said, "Hey, let's not start a fight. You start a fight, somebody might lose their temper, something might happen to you." Okay? Danites, early mobsters. So the Danites went their way, and Micah, seeing that they were too strong for him, turned around and went back home. Not much he could do. So he backs down. Then they took what Micah had made and his priest and went on to Laish against a peaceful and unsuspecting people. They attacked them with the sword and burned down their city. There was no one to rescue them because they lived a long way from Sidon and had no relationship with anyone else. The city was in a valley near Beth Rehob. The Danites rebuilt the city and settled there. They named it Dan after their forefather Dan, who was born to Israel, though the city used to be called Laish. There the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity of the land. They continued to use the idols Micah had made all the time the house of God was in Shiloh. meaning the house of God where they were supposed to be worshiping, was in Shiloh. So they go, they attack these unsuspecting Israelites, slaughter them all, take their city, and set up their shrine with their newly recruited priest. He and his descendants become their high priest up here in the north in Dan.
I guess what I'm wondering is, the town that they attacked, they appeared to be following the law, so why didn't God protect them?
Well, it doesn't say necessarily they're following the law, it just says that they were peaceful and not expecting an attack.
Even though they were staying
That's-
away from all the other.
Well, yeah, apparently they had no treaties with anybody. But even their fellow Israelites didn't come and protect them. They had no one.
If the Levite then could leave his tribe, and if you will, not even be a consecrated priest to do this, then what now at this period of time is happening where the Levites are tending to the temple, if you will?
Well, there is a group of Levites and priests descended from Aaron who are taking care of, at Shiloh, the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to once we get into 1 Samuel, we're going to kind of come back to them, see what's going on with them. A lot of them are not real morally upright either. We're going to find out. But they're at least...
The remnant of what is
Yeah, and they're at least in terms of the ceremony and everything doing what they're supposed to be doing, even if their lives are, their personal morality is kind of out of whack. But yeah, those services that were called for are going on at this time. Now again, that's biblically speaking. As I said at the beginning, archaeologists will say that religion didn't exist at this time. Everybody was a pagan. But biblically speaking, that is going on at this time, and we are going to sort of come back to that once we get into 1 Samuel and see what's been going on there. And while they have fallen into the same kind of moral sin problem, decay, that the rest of Israel has, they're at least going through the motions of offering the sacrifices at the right time and in the right way, and continuing that there. But meanwhile, these other religious things are going on in other parts of Israel. And here in Dan, there's one set up essentially permanently as a completely separate religious site. Okay. So that's the story now expanded a little bit that we read in that little 2-sentence thing of how Dan ended up in that little city instead of in the land they were supposed to take. They came and slaughtered and stole it from their fellow Israelites. Okay, so now chapter 19. This is the beginning of the final story in the book of Judges. It's kind of hard to summarize. But we'll see the moral decay continues. Chapter 19, verse 1. In those days, Israel had no king. Now a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Another auspicious beginning to a story. Okay. A Levite took a concubine. But she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her father's house in Bethlehem, Judah. After she had been there 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servant and 2 donkeys. She took him into her father's house, and when her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. His father-in-law, the girl's father, prevailed upon him to stay, so he remained with him 3 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. Okay. So he has this concubine. Okay. They have a domestic dispute. She goes back to her father's house. He decides to go after her. When he gets there, her father says, "Oh, Levite! This is a good potential son-in-law." So he takes him into his house, shows him hospitality for 3 days. On the 4th day they got up early and he prepared to leave, but the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Refresh yourself with something to eat, then you can go." So the 2 of them sat down to eat and drink together. Afterward the girl's father said, "Please stay tonight and enjoy yourself." When the man got up to go, his father-in-law persuaded him, so he stayed there that night. On the morning of the 5th day when he rose to go, the girl's father said, "Refresh yourself, wait till afternoon." So the two of them ate together. So she apparently really doesn't want to leave her father's house, so he keeps persuading him to stay. Verse 9, and then when the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said, "Now look, it's almost evening. Spend the night here. The day is nearly over. Stay and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow morning you can get up and be on your way home." But unwilling to stay another night, the man left and went toward Jebus, that is Jerusalem, with his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine. When they were near Jebus and the day was almost gone, the servant said to his master, "Come, let's stop at the city of the Jebusites and spend the night." Now remember, Jerusalem hasn't been captured by Israel yet. So these Jebusites are still living in Jerusalem and the area around it. So they come to one of these towns of the Jebusites. It's late at night. He finally got out of this guy's house with his concubine in tow. It's late at night, so they decide to stop here. His master replied, "No, we won't go into an alien city whose people are not Israelites. We will go on to Gibeah." He added, "Come, let's try to reach Gibeah or Ramah and spend the night in one of those places." So they went on, and the sun set as they neared Gibeah and Benjamin. Okay, so they say, "No, we're not going to stay in a Canaanite city," right? Because who knows what's going to go on in a Canaanite city. We're going to press on. So they press on as far as they can go. They finally get to a city of the tribe of Benjamin. They say, "Okay, finally here we'll spend the night." That evening, an old man, let's get verse 15 there, they stopped to spend the night. They went and sat in the city square, but no one took them into his home for the night. Okay, so they come into this town of Benjamin. What would be expected, since they're fellow Israelites, is that someone who owned a home in this town of Gibeah in Benjamin would extend hospitality to them, since they're travelers, and say, "Look, you can come and stay." So they go to the city square, kind of looking for somebody. Now, given it's very late at night, but they go to the city square looking for somebody to take them in. Nobody offers them hospitality. Verse 16, that evening an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who was living in Gibeah, the men of the place were Benjamites, came in from his work in the fields. When he looked and saw the traveler in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going? Where did you come from?" He answered, "We are on our way from Bethlehem in Judah to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim where I live. I've been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I am going to the house of the Lord. No one has taken me into his house." Okay. There's already a problem here. Because where did he say he was going first? A remote place in the hill country of Ephraim where he lives. Then he said, "I'm going to the house of Yahweh." Where's the house of Yahweh right now? Shiloh. So, whatever this house of Yahweh is that he's going to, right? This house or temple of Yahweh, it's not the tabernacle in Shiloh. Okay, so apparently he's working at yet another shrine somewhere in the hill country of Ephraim. So verse 19, we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys and bread and wine for ourselves, your servants, me, your maidservant, and the young man with us. We don't need anything. So he's saying, look, no one's taking us in. I'm not going to impose. We have food with us. We have food for the donkeys. We have food for us. We just need a place. We just need a place to sleep. "You are welcome at my house," the old man said. "Let me supply whatever you need, only don't spend the night in the square." So he took him into his house and fed his donkeys. After they had washed their feet, they had something to eat and drink. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house, pounding on the door. They shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." What does this remind you of? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Okay, so remember, the Levite says, "No, we don't want to stop in one of those Canaanite towns. Who knows what could happen there? We'll wait till we get to a town with our fellow Israelites." Right? So this is his fellow Israelites. Now, they become as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? hey, that traveler, no one knows where he's from, no one knows where he's going. If he just disappears, no one will know whatever happened to him. Verse 23, the owner of the house went outside and said to them, no, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this disgraceful thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But to this man, don't do such a disgraceful thing. Okay. So, now this seems a pretty horrible thing to do. Okay, but now keep in mind, you've got this big mob from the city, and you got one old man. Okay? So realistically, if this mob decided to just storm into his house, I mean, they could do whatever they want to do to everybody. Okay? So this is something of a desperate ploy from the old man. And Lot also offered his. Oh, sorry. So this old man is trying to do something. Verse 25, but the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them. And they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn they let her go. Okay. So he finally grabs the concubine, throws her outside. The men do all manner of terrible things to her. All night. At dawn they release her and apparently go back to their homes. At daybreak the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door and lay there until daylight. So she wanders back to where this house was and just collapses. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine. Now, first of all, what does this say about the Levite? The Levite, concubine gets thrown outside, and when he wakes up in the morning, his thought isn't,
Let's go.
what happened to my concubine? I need to go rescue her. I need to go find her. It's, well, back on my way to the hill country of Ephraim. Right? Opens the door, walks out, but she's laying there on the doorstep. There lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house, with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, get up, let's go. True love at last, in the book of Judges. But there was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home.
Here it says she was dead. Is she really dead?
It does not say she was dead.
Yeah, it does.
It just says she didn't answer.
Yeah, but I said
Here
it
it
looks like
says-
Bible.
Oh, it says she was dead?
It says she did not answer before she was dead.
So now he's hauling the corpse back to the house.
Yeah, it's not in there, but we'll see why that may have been. Because we'll see what's about to happen. He put her on his donkey and set out for home. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine. Okay, so I don't know if they're giving him the benefit of the doubt that he didn't kill her. It's ambiguous in the original whether he killed her or whether she was dead at the time. I think the Orthodox Study Bible is giving him the benefit of the doubt. That she was already dead and he... Yeah. So when he reached his home, he cuts up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts. Okay, so this is his response. Cuts her into 12 pieces and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Sends one to each tribe. Everyone who saw it said, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Think about it, consider it, tell us what to do. Right? So they're all kind of shocked when a piece of a concubine arrives. Right? At their elders, like, what is this? You know, like, this is what are we supposed to do about this? Okay, they're all sort of, what is this all about? So chapter 20, verse 1, then all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba, from the land of Gilead, came out as one man and assembled before the Lord in Mizpah. The leaders of all the people of the tribes of Israel took their places in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 soldiers armed with swords. The Benjamites heard that the Israelites had gone up to Mizpah. Then the Israelites said, tell us how this awful thing happened. Okay? So, They know something is up when they receive their concubine parts. So they go, they get all the men together, the fighting men, because remember, they don't have like a standing army. This is like a militia. It's all the men of the towns. They get together, they gather together, they go to see the Levite who sent these out, say, what happened? What's going on? Now we hear that the Benjamites heard that they were all going. So 11 tribes go out there. The Benjamites apparently don't send anyone. Okay, and Benjamin, of course, is where this happened. So the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, said, I and my concubine came to Gibeah and Benjamin to spend the night. During the night, the men of Gibeah came after me and surrounded the house, intending to kill me. They raped my concubine, and she died. I took my concubine, cut her into pieces, and sent one piece to each region of Israel's inheritance, because they committed this lewd and disgraceful act in Israel. Now, all you Israelites, speak up and give your verdict. All the people rose as one man, saying, none of us will go home. No, not one of us will return to his house. But now this is what we'll do to Gibeah. We'll go up against it as the lot directs. We'll take 10 men out of every 100 from all the tribes of Israel, and 100 from 1,000, and 1,000 from 10,000 to get provisions for the army. Then when the army arrives at Gibeah and Benjamin, it can give them what they deserve for all this vileness done in Israel. So all the men of Israel got together and united as one man against the city. So they go and they say, we'll take, obviously this is too big of an army to go throw at one city. So they say, we're going to take a tenth. We'll take a tenth out of the group that each tribe has sent, and we're going to go and take care of this city that did this. Verse 12, the tribes of Israel sent men throughout the tribe of Benjamin, saying, what about this awful crime that was committed among you? Now surrender those wicked men of Gibeah, so that we may put them to death and purge the evil from Israel. So they go to all the other cities in Benjamin and say, look, this is what these guys in Gibeah did. You need to help us. We want some men from Benjamin to come with our army to go take care of this hideous thing that they did. But the Benjamites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. So the Benjamites say, hey, they're our kin over there in Gibeah. I don't care what you say. From their towns they came together at Gibeah to fight against the Israelites. So they now raise up an army to go try and defend the city of Gibeah. And once the Benjamites mobilized 26,000 swordsmen from their towns, in addition to 700 chosen men from those living in Gibeah. Among all these soldiers there were 700 chosen men who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Okay, so they've got special forces. Remember we saw Ehud, one of the early judges, was from the tribe of Benjamin and was left-handed. So apparently this was a genetic trait that was being passed down to the tribe because people were marrying people of the same tribe. They had a lot of lefties. And these particular lefties have gotten real good with the sling. Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 swordsmen, all of them fighting men. The Israelites went up to Bethel and inquired of God. They said, who of us shall go first to fight against the Benjamites? The Lord replied, Judah shall go first. The next morning the Israelites got up and pitched camp near Gibeah. The men of Israel went out to fight the Benjamites and took up battle positions against them at Gibeah. The Benjamites came out of Gibeah and cut down 22,000 Israelites on the battlefield that day. But the men of Israel encouraged one another and again took up their positions where they had stationed themselves the first day. The Israelites went up and wept before the Lord until evening. And they inquired of the Lord. They said, shall we go up again to battle against the Benjamites, our brothers? So even though Gibeah has done this terrible thing, and the rest of these Benjamites are defending them, right? The fact that they have to attack their fellow Israelites is causing these people, they're weeping before the Lord. They don't want to do it. Slight contrast to our friends from Dan a couple chapters ago. Okay, so they're brokenhearted about the fact that they're having to attack their fellow Israelites. Okay, and so they go to God each day. They're going to God and saying, "Does this really need to happen? Does this really need to happen?" And the Lord's telling them, "Yes." Verse 24, then the Israelites drew near to Benjamin the second day. This time when the Benjamites came out from Gibeah to oppose them, they cut down another 18,000 Israelites, all of them armed with swords. Then the Israelites, all the people, went up to Bethel, and there they sat weeping before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings to the Lord. And the Israelites inquired of the Lord. Those days the ark of the covenant of God was there, with Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministering before it. They asked, "Shall we go up again to battle with Benjamin our brother or not?" The Lord responded, "Go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands." Then Israel set an ambush around Gibeah. They went up against the Benjamites on the third day and took up positions against Gibeah as they had done before. The Benjamites came out to meet them and were drawn away from the city. They began to inflict casualties on the Israelites as before, so that about 30 men fell in the open field and on the roads, the one leading to Bethel and the other to Gibeah. While the Benjamites were saying, "We are defeating them as before," the Israelites were saying, "Let's retreat and draw them away from the city to the roads." Okay. So this time, they start losing some men. Benjamites start getting confident, right? Day 3 of us inflicting mass casualties. So they start pressing the attack. The Israelites say, "Well, let's pull them out away from the city that they're besieging. Let's pull them back toward the road onto the flat land." All the men of Israel moved from their places and took up positions at Baal Tamar, and the Israelite ambush charged out of its place on the west of Gibeah. Then 10,000 of Israel's finest men made a frontal attack on Gibeah. The fighting was so heavy that the Benjamites did not realize how near disaster was. So they get pulled back away from the city. 10,000 Israelite men then rush into the city behind their army. And there's so much fighting going on that the Benjamite army doesn't realize that they've been flanked.
He didn't wear a uniform back then?
No. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and that day the Israelites struck down 25,100 Benjamites, all armed with swords. Then the Benjamites saw that they were beaten. And the men of Israel had given way before Benjamin because they relied on the ambush they had set near Gibeah. The men who had been in ambush made a sudden dash into Gibeah, spread out, and put the whole city to the sword. The men of Israel had arranged with the ambush that they should send up a great cloud of smoke from the city, and then the men of Israel would turn in the battle. So they're dropping back. The Benjamites are following them. The ambush goes into the city, and they say, once you've taken the city, send up a big cloud of smoke, and then rather than pulling them back, we'll press back into the Benjamite army. The Benjamites had begun to inflict casualties on the men of Israel, about 30. They said, "We are defeating them as the first battle." But when the column of smoke began to rise from the city, the Benjamites turned and saw the smoke of the whole city going up into the sky. Then the men of Israel turned on them, and the men of Benjamin were terrified because they realized that disaster had come upon them. So they fled before the Israelites in the direction of the desert, but they could not escape the battle, and the men of Israel who came out of the towns cut them down there. They surrounded the Benjamites, chased them, and easily overran them in the vicinity of Gibeah on the east. 18,000 Benjamites fell, all of them valiant fighters. As they turned and fled toward the desert to the rock of Rimmon, the Israelites cut down 5,000 men along the roads. They kept pressing after the Benjamites as far as Gittim and struck down 2,000 more. On that day, 25,000 Benjamite swordsmen fell, all of them valiant fighters. But 600 men turned and fled into the desert to the rock of Rimmon, where they stayed 4 months. The men of Israel went back to Benjamin and put all the towns to the sword, including the animals and everything else they found. All the towns they came across they set on fire. What's the significance of that? That's how they were supposed to treat the Canaanites. That's how they were supposed to treat the Canaanites. So at least a chunk of Israel, tribe of Benjamin, has become just as bad as the Canaanites that they came there to displace. Or worse. They're right there with Sodom.
Did the Lord command them to burn all those cities, or was that also?
No, that was the command when they went. Chapter 21, verse 1.
They had done what God had said, this will not
Yeah.
happen.
The men of Israel had taken an oath at Mizpah, "Not one of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite." The people went to Bethel, where they sat before God until evening. Raising their voices and weeping bitterly, "O Lord, the God of Israel," they cried, "why has this happened to Israel? Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today?" So they took this vow that they wouldn't give their daughters, meaning they're treating Benjamin like it's, as far as they're concerned, a Benjamite wanting to marry one of their daughters is like a Philistine wanting to marry one of their daughters. And they come before the Lord. But again, they're not happy about this. They're not angry. They're not vengeful toward the Benjamites. They're coming and weeping before the Lord and saying, why are we now down a tribe? Why did this tribe have to be wiped out? Why did this have to happen? Early the next day, the people built an altar and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Israelites asked, "Who from all the tribes of Israel has failed to assemble before the Lord?" For they had taken a solemn oath that everyone who failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah should certainly be put to death. So that's how seriously they take this mourning, this collective mourning that they're having for the people of Benjamin and what's just happened. The Israelites grieved for their brothers, the Benjamites. "Today one tribe is cut off from Israel," they said. "How can we provide wives for those who are left, since we have taken an oath by the Lord not to give them any of our daughters in marriage?" So they've killed all these men. They've killed all the young fighting men of Benjamin now. So they're is Benjamin now going to die out? They're saying, we took this oath that we wouldn't give our daughters to them because of the way they were behaving. Are we going to have to follow through on this and let them die off? Then they asked, "Which one of the tribes of Israel failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah?" They discovered that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp for the assembly. For when they counted the people, they found that none of the people of Jabesh Gilead were there. So the assembly sent 12,000 fighting men with instructions to go to Jabesh Gilead and put to the sword those living there, including the women and children. "This is what you are to do," they said. "Kill every male and every woman who is not a virgin." They found among the people living in Jabesh Gilead 400 young women who had never slept with a man, and they took them to the camp at Shiloh in Canaan. Okay? So their solution to the problem of how are we going to perpetuate the tribe of Benjamin, and you notice this one isn't coming from the Lord. Right? Their solution is, well, who didn't obey our order to show up here and mourn? So they find this one town didn't. So they go there and kill everybody except the young women and say, well, now we have wives for the Benjamites.
Father, I don't understand. They went and killed all the Benjamites, so the Benjamite women would be left. Why would they bring in
The older women,
Oh,
right? And the men who are too young to go fight, the young boys.
okay.
So the idea is these young virgins are going to marry the young boys when they come of age in Benjamin, so that there will be a next generation in Benjamin. Then the assembly sent an offer of peace to the Benjamites at the rock of Rimmon, those who fled and were in hiding. So the Benjamites returned at that time and were given the women of Jabesh Gilead who had been spared, but there were not enough for all of them. People grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a gap in the tribes of Israel. The elders of the assembly said, "With the women of Benjamin destroyed, how shall we provide wives for the men who are left? The Benjamite survivors must have heirs." They said, "So that a tribe of Israel will not be wiped out. We can't give them our daughters as wives, since we Israelites have taken this oath. Cursed be anyone who gives a wife to a Benjamite. But look, there is the annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh, to the north of Bethel, and east of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem and to the south of Lebonah." So he instructed the Benjamites, saying, "Go and hide in the vineyards and watch. When the girls of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, then rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize a wife from the girls of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin." Again, not a solution that they got from the Lord. They said, "Oh, hey, there's this festival going on. When you see one of the dancing girls, jump out of the bushes, grab her,
Come on.
and take her back to Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers complain to us about this, as they will, we will say to them, 'Do us a kindness by helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war. Do us a solid.'" and you are innocent since you did not give your daughters to them. They're like, look, you didn't technically give your daughter to a Benjamite, right? The Benjamite took her, right? And since we did get them wives after the war, just, kind of overlook it. So that is what the Benjamites did. While the girls were dancing, each man caught one and carried her off to be his wife. Then they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and settled in them. Now, do you see the irony here? What was the problem in the first place? They grabbed a woman, right? They grabbed a woman against her will and used her. That got everyone so angry that they had to go and wipe out the tribe of Benjamin. And now they say, well, geez, we don't have wives. We'll just go grab one. Right? This is how lost the people of Israel are at this point.
You sure God chose these people?
Well, as we saw, God chose them to come and inhabit this land. He also gave land to the Edomites. He also gave land to, okay? So they rebuild their towns. Verse 24, at that time the Israelites left that place and went home to their tribes and clans, each to his own inheritance. In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. So we saw those last few chapters. They keep pointing out there's no king. So they're like sheep without a shepherd. Right? They're all just kind of wandering, stumbling around.
And killing each other.
And these horrible atrocities are happening because the knowledge of God is gone. There's no direction, there's no leadership, there's no Moses, right? There's no Joshua. They had a few good judges early on, but the last few of them have left a lot to be desired in the leadership department. Right? In fact, Samson never led anybody anywhere. Right? So this is a sad state. Now, this is where Judges leaves off. This is a very dark period, obviously, in the history of Israel. When we get to 1 Samuel, we're going to see the beginning of God's solution to this problem.
He's going to try again.
This problem that there's no leader and no direction, and that the knowledge of the law of God is gone. We're going to start to see the solution. In between, though, next week, next Sunday night, one night only, we're going to have the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, which only has 4 chapters. It's something like a romance novel from the early Iron Age. Okay? And there's a reason it's here between Judges and 1 Samuel that we'll see when we get to the end. It takes place during this period of Judges. There is nowhere near as much mayhem or violence or dismemberment or murder. More love story. Dashing hero, young widow, that kind of thing. So we'll be talking about the book of Ruth in its entirety next week.
Father Stephen, what is your opinion that in the Bible there are so many stories that are so similar? How would you explain something like that?
Well, I mean, the way, for example, we saw Sodom and
the attack. I mean, that's one most obvious. But yet it is the only difference in this, as I remember, the only difference in this story, it's a little more detailed than the other story where it was in Sidon.
And Sodom, right?
Yeah.
And instead of fire from heaven, it's the Israelites who come and
They come and they do the same thing. They come out of the city,
burn the city.
and then they burn the city. And yet there's so, and this is not just the only one. There's other stories that seem to be so parallel in the Bible.
Well, part of the scriptures reference each other. And it's not just, I mean, we commonly think about, the New Testament has references to the Old Testament. Right? But that's true not only in that macro level of New Testament and Old Testament. That's true as we're seeing within the Old Testament. Right? The Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the books of Moses, sort of form the basis of Scripture. Okay? These books we're reading now that are talking about the history of Israel, they're sometimes called the Deuteronomic history. because the terms they use to describe the historical events are drawn from the Pentateuch, specifically for the book of Deuteronomy. Meaning it's the history of Israel viewed through a very particular lens. Now, as believers, we'd say this is God's lens, right? This is God's perspective on what's going on. From a purely secular materialist viewpoint, you would say this is the lens of the other texts of Scripture, being applied to those events. But it's a self-conscious referencing. The intent is that when you read that story of what's happening in that town in Benjamin, it's intended that you remember Sodom. And say, whoa, this is an Israelite city, and it's like Sodom.
And it's coming to you.
And that you see that the Israelites coming and destroying these towns is like the fire of God coming, that it's God's judgment. Right? That this isn't just a religious accounting of an Israelite civil war. Right? That in this is God's judgment on Benjamin, to some extent, for what it did. But then how, even in applying that judgment at this point in history, the rest of Israel isn't really faithful with what happens afterwards with the wives. So those similarities are intentional. Those are things to be looking for, because that's what gives us an interpretation of the text. That I can take this text and sit it in front of a Jewish person, or a Muslim, or anyone from any Christian denomination, and say, okay, look at this text, the way this is described. Look at Sodom. See how this is, right? And they can see that. You don't need any particular religious presuppositions. It's just there. Right? And the best way to start interpreting the Scriptures is to let them interpret themselves first. Let them interpret themselves and go from there. And we're going to see, especially when you get into the New Testament, especially when we get into the Gospels. The Gospels are going to describe the events of Jesus' life in very particular ways that are supposed to make you think back to these things of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And remember the prophecies, and remember, this is saying, because there are many very subtle things in the Gospels, for example, which to us as modern Americans, if we never read the Old Testament and we just picked it up and read the Gospels, it would mean almost nothing to us. But if you know the Old Testament prophecies, Jesus will say or do something, and you'll say, okay, this is claiming he's the king of Israel. Because you remember, or this is claiming, he's claiming Moses' authority, So it's a very conscious thing inside the Scriptures. And it's something to look for. I know you will sometimes see on, again, the infamous documentaries and scholarly books on these subjects, where they'll just say, the author of such and such wasn't very creative, he stole this story from whatever.
Yeah,
but that's a very shallow, a very shallow reading of the text. Right? I mean, if I pick up a novel and there's something that's written today, and there's something in it that's alluding to something in Shakespeare, I don't assume, this guy stole this from Shakespeare. Right? I assume that this person is aware of Shakespeare, I'm aware of Shakespeare, and he's alluding to something that we both understand to help me interpret it. So that's how I interpret the similarities. It's that the author of and compiler of Judges assumes that you've read the 5 books of Moses, assumes that you've read the Pentateuch. And so he can communicate almost a shorthand that way. He doesn't have to say, see, Gibeah is like Sodom. He could just tell the story in that way, and you see it and make the connection. Does that make sense?
Why do historians value originality anyway?
Well, it's a way to devalue texts, which is what they want to get away from.
Instead of saying that these other guys are also good historians?
Right. Because they want to be able to construct their own narratives. Okay, anybody else have any other questions?
stole the money, but he gave it back. He gave it back, and they made it into the idol, but the Levite comes, and he offers him hospitality. He brings him into his house. He treats him like a son. And then he said, well, the Lord will be pleased, which was bad. I mean, but maybe he really thought that.
Well-
But in the end, he just gets robbed, and then the Danites go off in their merry way, leave the town, kill all the people. And
But Micah is not presented as per se evil. He's more kind of clueless.
but God doesn't
It's more kind of he doesn't know any better.
But God doesn't ever come and help him, and then God comes and helps him.
Well, he doesn't curse him or or anything either. He gets his idol stolen. But he's not presented as being wicked per se. He's just sort of clueless. He's sort of clueless. And he's there to show us the level of religious knowledge that a person living in Israel at that time possessed, which is not much. Right? His understanding is just way off. And you're like, what? So that it's more that it's not that they're saying that Micah is horribly wicked. It's more he's more on the clueless side, sort of like Samson's parents when they're like, "What do you mean we should raise him to be?" They sort of just don't know because their parents and their parents' parents fell down on the job and didn't teach them.
I was wondering why this concubine was so, didn't really have a whole lot of respect for her.
Obviously, yeah.
Okay. So, and then taking her body parts to all these people to kill because of her, and then they kill other women. What was the significance? I mean, like, why was her death such a bad thing that they had to kill everybody else?
Okay, well, a concubine, you have to remember the difference between a concubine and a wife is that a concubine was a slave. Okay. So he owned her, essentially. It wasn't a wife, it was he owned her and used her sexually. Okay. So the problem he had, it's not that he deeply respected her and was sad that she was dead. It's that them taking and abusing his property that way was a slight at him. He's not the good guy in that story at all. Okay? He's not a good guy at all. The people of Gibeah are clearly bad guys, right? I mean, that we're supposed to see that they're like Sodom. Okay? The concubine is something of a victim. She seems to have not wanted to be a concubine, as we can tell the way she snuck off back to her father and then kept trying to keep him at her father and not leave with him. Okay? So if there's anybody innocent in any of these stories we read tonight, it's that concubine, right? Who was someone's owned property, okay? Which is again something a Levite shouldn't have been doing in the first place. If you go back to Leviticus, but yeah, it was not some kind of noble love he suddenly had for her that inspired this war. It was, look at this disrespect that these Benjamites
Did to me.
heaped on me. By doing this to my property. Because obviously if he really loved and treasured her, his first would be to cut her up in pieces and mail her around.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he would have just called everybody together and said, my beloved wife maybe, was murdered and raped by these horrible people,